In this video, I'm going to talk about how to sew knit, and more specifically, how to sew nylon. So the type of nylons that you would have on tights. So to do this, obviously, you will need nylons. I like using nylons for cosplay, doing any kind of bodysuit thing, because they look really good, especially if you're doing something that's like body paint. So if you're doing any kind of like Star Wars character or alien that has like unnatural colored skin, this is really great. You're going to need thread. You're also going to want some heat and bond adhesive. There's a couple different kinds you can get, different widths, different strengths. For this, I have a Stitch Witchery fusible interfacing that's just like a normal, and then I have a heat and bond adhesive that this one is a little bit wider, so you can kind of maybe see, and this one is a little bit narrower, and they're used for different things. When I go over how to sew like regular stitch, I have some elastic, because sometimes when you do alterations to knit, you want to use elastic. You're going to need fray check. This fray check is my favorite brand of fray check because it does not bleed as much as the fray check brand fray check. So what I like to use is Eileen's Stop Fraying. You'll also need pins, a marker of some kind to mark your fabric, and you're going to need a sewing machine. I will be using a serger to talk about how you can sew different kinds of knits together, but that's not necessary to do this. You will also need an iron to do your fusible interfacing. And you'll also need a piece of scrap fabric to protect your home iron from the glue in your heat and bond. All right, really quick, I'd like to go over a couple things. Firstly, I want to talk about different kinds of stretch fabric. You have things like a net, which will tend to have a four-way stretch, and a four-way stretch means you can stretch it on any axis. So you can have this direction, you have this direction, you also have this direction, and this direction. So this fabric is a really good example of a four-way stretch that is not super stretchy. Different kinds of stretch have different amounts of stretch, and you can usually find information about that on, if you're ordering fabric online, how much stretch it has in each direction. And sometimes if you're at a store, you can find that on the end of the bolt. But my favorite thing is, if I'm in a store, I like to just try it, to just stretch it myself and see how stretchy it is. So as you can see, this has some stretch, but not a lot. So if I try to adhere it to something like this, which is really, really stretchy, it's not going to work super great. This type of stretch material will not run or fray. Anything that is vinyl or anything that is coated like holographic won't fray either. The thing is that if this is stretched too much, sometimes it'll crack. So you want to make sure when you're buying fabric, if you want it to be able to stretch, sometimes things can stretch, but they're not supposed to. You want to make sure it's something that if it can stretch, it's not going to crack. And something like this, when it's stretched, it'll lose some of its shine. So you can see it gets slightly less holographic once it's been pulled. So those are all just things to think about when you're looking at vinyl stretch. Then you have things that are actually the true knit. So knit is when it's actually like a loop process. A nylon is a knit, which is why nylons will run. And this fabric right here is also a knit. This fabric is less likely to run because it is less delicate than a nylon, but it is still very similar consistency. This is a spandex knit. This type of material is the most forgiving when it comes to knit. It will not scar. It tends not to pucker as much as something like a net. It won't run like anything that's like a true knit. Any kind of vinyl or coated knit will scar when you're sewing it. So when you if you have to rip it out, you will see where your stitches were. These are all just things to take into consideration when you're looking at buying a stretch fabric. And it all just depends on your project and your skill level. I always recommend starting with something like this, but nylons are the most convenient thing if you are trying to do something that looks like skin. I'm going to go over the different kinds of stitches that you can use when sewing stretch. There is no good hand stitch that you can use to sew stretch. Generally, a hand stitch will not be strong enough and it won't stretch with the material. So my favorite type of stitch to use is a serge. If you have a serger, that's really great. They're really kind of difficult to work with if you're not super familiar with it. And with a serge, you can do this type of stitch. And you can also do a woolly nylon stitch. Woolly nylon is a specific kind of thread that has extra stretch built into the thread itself. So you'll get the most stretch with a woolly nylon, but woolly nylon is really, really temperamental. You can also some home machines will have a straight stretch stitch. The most common and easiest thing to use is a zigzag stitch. Every home machine will have a zigzag stitch on it, and it will give you a really decent amount of stretch. And if you change the settings to make it wider, and so the stitch will be wider but the length is shorter, you'll get even more stretch out of it. And it works pretty good for most things. You can actually use the zigzag stitch to adhere different types of stretch together. So here's a stretch vinyl and it's being adhered to a net. And here's another example of a vinyl stretch, and this is a zigzag, so you can see it being pulled. It does have a little bit of puckering, but for the most part it's pretty clean. And so as you can see, when you sew nylons with a zigzag stitch, it tends to create curling and puckering, which is fine. But if you want a really smooth finish, kind of like how the tights are when you buy them, the best method I have found is to actually use heat and bond. Okay, so I have set up my ironing mat and I've set up my iron. I put my iron on blend. You can do this, you just have to be really careful not to burn what you're doing. Home irons can get really hot, so just want to be extra careful that you're not going to burn what you're working on. So I have my nylons turned inside out. For this, I'm making some arm socks right now. And I basically just want to turn this hem under like so and fuse it down. This is because I don't want to have seam or any kind of stitching on this, as it ruins the kind of smooth effect that you get when you don't have that. So I'm going to use this really thin Stitch Witch inner heat and bond that I have to do this. I don't even cut this, I just take it and then I very carefully fold over what I want. This is kind of a tedious process.
I just wanted to take this moment to point out that what I have done with these tights is I've cut the feet off, just like the very edge of the feet, and I have put fray check on them at the very edge there. I just used the fray check that I mentioned earlier in the video, the Eileen's fray stop.
So after I have basically gotten it a little bit stuck down where I kind of want it to be, then I'll flip it over and iron it on the other side just to make sure that it's all sticking, because you can see like something like that won't stick. And as you can see, this is what it looks like afterwards. I go through and trim off any kind of like lumpy bumpies that we might have left over, and just do a like little stretch test around it to see if it's holding everywhere that I want it to be. And this looks pretty good. It will kind of like crack a little bit as you stretch it, but that's just part of it. And then here you can see there's an unstuck part, so I'll do that again. So the reason I love this technique is because when you turn it inside out, it will be virtually seamless. So as you can see, you can barely see where it has been glued. And then if you put your hand through it, it creates a very seamless, smooth line. So I use this same technique on a kind of like yoke collar piece that I make, but I do it with a thicker interfacing so that the band is a little bit thicker, because when you wear something on your neck, it wants to roll. And we don't want that to happen. And I'm going to repeat the same steps that I just did on that, but with this and with a thicker heat and bond. So now I'm going to show you how to sew elastic onto something stretchy. First, you're going to get the length of the piece of elastic that you want, and then you're going to start pinning it into your fabric. So I'm doing elastic on some nylons for some arm socks, because I like to put elastic on the neckline of them. I just think it adds a lot more strength and stability long term. So I'm going to start by pinning the end, and I'm actually going to come all the way around again and pin the other end together. So there'll be a little bit of an overlap, and you want this like overlap to be at the back, but you're just gonna fold it in there. I'm just doing this so that the nylon just barely covers the elastic, and then we're just gonna zigzag over it. So then what you want to do is you want to find the middle of your elastic. You want to find the middle of your the other side of your piece. Basically, you're just gonna split the difference between this. And this is how you would sew elastic for a lot of things. And there are a lot of tutorials on how to sew elastic, so I'm not going to walk you through this whole step, but this is how you would do it on nylons. So a lot of times when you're sewing elastic, actually what you'll be doing is the opposite of what I'm doing, and you'll be stretching the elastic to fit inside the fabric, and the piece of fabric that you will have will be bigger than the piece of elastic you will have. The reason you do the opposite for something like this, for nylons, is because the nylons are actually going to be smaller than whatever it is you're doing. So now you can see I've got it pinned all the way around, and I'm just gonna sew it on a zigzag on my machine.
One quick thing I want to point out is I never sew over pins. I know some people say that you can sew over pins if they are sideways, but this is really dangerous as your needle can still hit the pin and it can break and fly into your eyes. I just highly recommend that you do not sew over pins.
So now you know several different ways to sew nylon. A couple last things. If you are sewing by hand, for example, you are wearing the tights, or a model is wearing the tights, or a friend is wearing the tights, and you're stitching something onto it by hand, as I said, every time you cut something, fray check it. Every time you sew something, fray check it as well. So anytime there's any kind of tension being put on a nylon or any kind of knit that has an actual knit material and is not just woven spandex, make sure that you are fray checking it, because as soon as one of those loops comes loose, it will run. You can sew on nylons by hand if you have something, you're wearing it and you really want to put something that is not stretchy onto it. Go right ahead. Just make sure you are fray checking as you go. So every time you do an inch or so, put a little bit of fray check on it. Or put a little bit of glue on it. You could even use Elmer's glue, tacky glue, any kind of water-based non-toxic glue that won't hurt your skin. And that is all for this video. Thank you guys so much. I hope this is helpful, and I'll see you in the next one.